Jack Miller had survived years as a Navy SEAL, but at 47, he was sleeping in a battered Chevrolet with only his German Shepherd Buddy beside him. Then his millionaire father died and left him just one thing: a worthless mountain lodge abandoned for nearly 30 years. His stepmother urged him to sell it for $25,000 and walk away. Jack almost did, until Buddy discovered something hidden behind a wall that no one was supposed to find. What waited beneath Pine Ridge would expose a $180 million secret and reveal why Jack's father had spent his final days terrified of the woman sleeping beside him. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what you would have done in Jack's place. And stay with us, because Buddy's discovery was only the beginning. Snow had been falling over western Colorado since before dawn, softening the edges of warehouses, highway barriers, and distant mountains until the whole valley seemed quieter than it really was. Jack Miller woke beneath that gray sky with his shoulder pressed against the driver's door of an aging dark blue Chevrolet Suburban. At 47, Jack still carried traces of the man who had once served as a Navy SEAL. 6'2", lean rather than bulky, broad through the shoulders with weathered features, a square jaw covered by several days of dark gray stubble, and short brown hair turning silver around the temples. A thin scar crossed his right eyebrow, but the deeper marks of his past were less visible. Years in the military had taught him to wake at the smallest sound, measure every room before entering it, and remain calm when other people panicked. None of that had taught him how to make $300 last until the end of the month. Beside him, Buddy raised his head from a pile of folded blankets. The 8-year-old German Shepherd was large, but beginning to show his age, with a black and tan coat, a graying muzzle, warm brown eyes, and a small notch along his left ear. Buddy stretched, placed one paw against Jack's thigh, and stared at him expectantly. "Yeah," Jack murmured. "Breakfast. The great adventure continues." He opened the glove compartment, took out the last 2 dog biscuits, and gave Buddy both of them. His own breakfast would be gas station coffee if he could convince himself that $2 was no longer important. 11 months earlier, Jack had still had a job, a rented room, and the modest dignity of knowing exactly when his next paycheck would arrive. After leaving the Navy, he had deliberately chosen ordinary work, eventually spending more than a decade maintaining conveyor systems and loading equipment at a regional distribution center. He liked machinery because machinery rarely lied. A broken bearing announced itself. A failing motor smelled hot. A damaged belt could be replaced. People were harder. When the company consolidated operations, Jack and nearly 60 other workers were dismissed within a week. His savings covered rent for a while, then food, insurance, and repairs to the Chevrolet. Eventually, the numbers stopped pretending they might work. What made his fall stranger was that Jack had grown up with money. His father, Robert Miller, had built a real estate fortune worth more than Jack could comfortably imagine. Robert had been a tall, imposing man, with neatly combed silver hair, steel blue eyes, and the polished manners of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He could charm investors across a dinner table and terrify contractors with a raised eyebrow. Yet with his only son, affection often became expectation. Things had worsened after Jack's mother, Margaret, died. She had been the soft center of the Miller household, and her death left 2 stubborn men grieving in opposite directions. Within 2 years, Robert announced he intended to marry Diane Reynolds. Jack had distrusted her almost immediately. He could never prove anything, but he noticed how Diane asked about trusts before she asked about Robert's childhood, how her warmth sharpened whenever money entered the conversation, and how quickly she learned which executives mattered. Jack warned his father. Robert heard only jealousy. Their final argument remained one of Jack's least favorite memories, because he could still remember every foolish word. Robert accused him of judging a woman who had helped him survive loneliness. Jack accused Robert of replacing his mother with someone who loved the Miller name more than the man carrying it. Robert defended Diane with such fury that Jack finally said, "If you marry her, don't call me home." Robert, too proud to retreat, had answered, "Then perhaps you should stop expecting there to be one." Diane married him 3 months later. Jack never asked for another dollar from his father, even when things became difficult, and Robert never broke the silence either. For years, Jack told himself that was principle. Lately, sitting in a cold Chevrolet, it sometimes felt suspiciously like pride. His phone vibrated on the dashboard shortly after 8 that morning. The caller introduced himself as Richard Cole, Robert Miller's attorney. Richard's voice was smooth, controlled, and almost unnaturally patient. He informed Jack that Robert had died 2 days earlier after a rapid decline in health, and that the will would be read that afternoon in Denver. Jack said nothing for several seconds. He had imagined receiving that news many times. He had never imagined how little victory there would be in being the son who had been right. Richard Cole's office occupied the upper floors of a glass building where even the lobby smelled expensive. Jack arrived wearing clean jeans, worn work boots, and the only decent charcoal shirt he still owned. Buddy remained in the Chevrolet with the windows cracked and a blanket on the rear seat. Inside the conference room, Jack met Richard for the first time. The attorney was 55, medium height, and narrow through the chest, with pale skin, carefully trimmed salt and pepper hair, a precise gray beard, and rectangular glasses that seemed chosen to make him appear thoughtful. He spoke gently to the receptionist, thanked an assistant for bringing water, and treated every movement as though someone might later describe it in court. Diane was already seated beside him. At 52, she remained striking. Tall and slender, with smooth, fair skin, shoulder-length honey blonde hair, carefully understated makeup, and a cream wool coat that probably cost more than Jack's Chevrolet. Her elegance had always been controlled rather than warm. When she looked at Jack's frayed cuffs, sympathy appeared on her face half a second too late. "Jack," she said softly, "I'm sorry things have been difficult for you." He wondered who had told her. Then he realized the Chevrolet was visible through the conference room windows far below. "I manage," he replied. Diane gave him the small, sorrowful smile people reserved for situations they were secretly grateful did not belong to them. The will was less dramatic than Jack expected. Robert had arranged investments, trusts, charitable gifts, and property transfers with the same precision he had once used to run his companies. Diane appeared to inherit the mansion outside Denver, substantial financial interests, and access to several family assets, though Richard moved through the legal details quickly. Then he reached Jack. Robert's only son received one property, Pine Ridge Lodge, an abandoned mountain resort on roughly 24 acres several hours west of Denver. Richard paused before explaining that the lodge had been closed for almost 30 years. Weather damage was severe, utilities were disconnected, portions of the roof were unsafe, and restoring the property could cost far more than its obvious market value. Diane lowered her eyes as though embarrassed on Robert's behalf. "Your father could be cruel when he felt betrayed," she said. "I'm sorry, Jack." "Truly." Jack stared at the photograph Richard placed before him. Pine Ridge was a sprawling timber and stone lodge surrounded by dark pines and mountains, but even in the old photograph, something about it looked lonely. His father had owned towers, commercial buildings, development parcels, and luxury homes. Why leave his estranged son a ruin? Before Jack could ask, Richard slid another document across the table. A private holding company, he explained, was willing to take the liability immediately and pay Jack $25,000 for the property. Cash settlement could begin as soon as he signed. $25,000. Jack hated how quickly his mind spent it. A proper apartment, repairs to the Chevrolet, several months without calculating the price of every meal. Buddy could see a veterinarian for the stiffness developing in his rear legs. Jack could breathe again. He picked up the pen and felt Diane watching him. "It's the sensible choice," she said. Richard nodded. "Pine Ridge will consume money you simply don't have." Jack looked at the signature line, then at the photograph again. Years of military training had left him with habits he could not switch off, and one of them was noticing when people wanted something too badly. Richard had prepared the sale before Jack had even heard the will. Diane knew the price. Neither had suggested he visit the property, obtain an independent valuation, or even sleep on the decision. They were behaving as though $25,000 were generosity, yet their attention was fixed on his hand, as if the pen contained the combination to a vault. Jack slowly placed it on the table. Diane's expression barely changed, but the fingers around her water glass tightened. Richard leaned forward. "Is there a problem?" Jack studied him, then Diane. He thought of his father, of their last argument, of 13 years of silence, and of a ruined lodge that apparently mattered enough for two wealthy people to want it gone before sundown. "No problem," Jack said, taking the property documents instead. "I'm just not selling it." For the first time that afternoon, Richard Cole stopped smiling. The road to Pine Ridge climbed steadily into the mountains, narrowing from wet pavement to cracked asphalt, and then to a snow-packed lane bordered by dark pines. Jack drove slowly, one hand on the wheel and the other resting near Buddy, who sat upright in the passenger seat watching the forest pass. By late afternoon, the lodge finally appeared beyond a bend. A long, weather-beaten structure of timber and stone, its roof sagging in places, several windows shattered, and the old sign hanging crooked above the entrance. Time had not merely abandoned Pine Ridge, it had worked on it patiently. Snow had collected inside broken sections of the roof. Vines had died against the stone walls, and the front steps groaned under Jack's weight. Buddy moved through the lobby first, nose low, claws clicking softly across warped floorboards. Jack found no electricity, no running water, and no working furnace. After checking the rooms one by one, he chose a small ground-floor room near the rear of the lodge where the ceiling was still solid, and the windows could be covered with old plywood. That first night, Jack burned scraps of dry wood in a rusted fireplace, ate canned beans with a plastic spoon, and gave Buddy the last of the beef jerky. He tried not to think about the conference room in Denver or Diane's face when he refused to sell. Still, one thought kept returning. If Pine Ridge was truly worthless, why had two wealthy people looked so relieved when they thought he might sign it away? The next morning, Jack drove into the nearest town, a small mountain community called Elk River. The main street held a grocery store, a diner, a hardware shop, and several businesses with faded signs that suggested better years had passed through and kept going. Jack found temporary work almost immediately because a snowstorm had damaged the rear loading dock of a feed store. The owner, Tom Harris, was a stocky man in his early 60s with a square red face, close-cropped white hair, and hands thickened by decades of lifting sacks and repairing machinery. He spoke plainly, distrusted excuses, and paid cash at the end of the day. Tom had lost his younger brother in a logging accident years earlier, which had left him with a habit of checking twice on anyone working around heavy equipment. He noticed Jack's efficiency, but did not ask about the military tattoo partly hidden beneath his sleeve. "You know tools," Tom said instead. Jack shrugged. "Tools make sense." Tom laughed once and handed him another wrench. By sunset, Jack had earned enough for groceries, lamp oil, dog food, and a few basic repair supplies. It was not much, but carrying those bags back into Pine Ridge felt strangely better than inheriting a fortune would have. He had earned them. Over the next several days, a rough routine formed. Jack worked whenever Tom or someone else in Elk River needed an extra pair of hands, then returned to the lodge before dark. He patched leaks with tarps, cleared broken glass, reinforced the door to his room, and dragged fallen branches away from the rear entrance. Buddy followed him constantly but developed an odd fascination with the old manager's office near the east wing. The room itself was unremarkable: a collapsed desk, mold-stained cabinets, peeling wallpaper, and a tall bookcase leaning against one wall. Yet Buddy repeatedly stopped near the bookcase and pressed his nose toward the narrow gap between it and the stone. At first, Jack assumed mice were nesting inside. Then he noticed something else. A faint thread of colder air brushed the back of his hand whenever he stood there. Buddy also seemed interested in an old wool coat hanging from a rusted hook nearby. The coat carried only dust to Jack, but Buddy sniffed it with unusual concentration, then returned to the wall. Jack remembered Robert wearing a similar dark coat when he was younger, and dismissed the thought as coincidence. "You find a treasure map in there," he told Buddy. "You're paying for dinner." Buddy stared at him solemnly, as if considering the terms. On the fifth evening, Jack returned later than usual after helping Tom repair a damaged loading gate. Snow had begun falling again, thick enough to erase his tire tracks within minutes. Inside Pine Ridge, everything seemed normal until Buddy froze halfway down the hallway. His ears lifted, the muscles along his back tightened. Jack stopped immediately. Years away from the SEAL teams had not erased the instinct to trust a warning before understanding it. Buddy moved toward the manager's office without barking, nose pointed forward. Then came a faint scrape from inside. Someone was there. Jack switched off his flashlight and stepped closer to the wall while Buddy advanced another few feet. A thin beam of light flashed beneath the office door. Jack reached for the heavy adjustable wrench tucked through his belt and pushed the door open. A shadow moved behind the desk. Buddy exploded into a deep bark, and the intruder bolted through a broken side window before Jack could get a clear look at him. Jack crossed the room in seconds, reached the window, and saw only a dark figure running between the trees toward the old service road. He did not chase. The snow was deep, the woods unfamiliar, and Buddy mattered more than catching a stranger. Instead, Jack searched the office carefully. Nothing obvious had been stolen because there was almost nothing left to steal. But the bookcase Buddy had been watching had been pulled several inches away from the wall. Someone had been examining the same area. Near the broken window, Jack found a small metal object, half buried in dust. It was a silver cufflink, expensive-looking, engraved with a simple black letter C. Jack turned it between his fingers. Richard Cole wore French cuffs at the will reading, but Jack had not paid enough attention to remember the design. That did not prove anything. It did, however, prove that Pine Ridge had visitors who did not want to be seen. Buddy returned to the wall and began sniffing intensely along the baseboard. Jack crouched beside him and placed his palm near the narrow crack. The cold draft was stronger now that the bookcase had moved. He knocked once against the surface. The sound was wrong. Not solid stone. Something hollow sat behind it. For several seconds, Jack simply listened. The lodge creaked around him as wind pressed against the roof. Buddy remained beside the wall, alert but calm now that the stranger was gone. Jack looked again at the cufflink, then at the space behind the bookcase. He had spent years training himself not to build conclusions from incomplete information. A hidden cavity did not mean treasure. A cufflink did not mean Richard Cole. A stranger in an abandoned lodge could still be a thief looking for copper wire. Yet the facts were beginning to lean in one direction. Cole had offered money too quickly. Diane had wanted the sale completed before Jack even saw the property. Now someone had entered Pine Ridge at night and searched the exact wall Buddy had been noticing since they arrived. Jack slipped the cufflink into his pocket and pushed the office door closed. "All right," he said quietly to Buddy. "Tomorrow we find out what they were looking for." Buddy gave one slow wag of his tail and sat beside the wall as though he had already known that was the plan. Morning came pale and windless, the storm having sealed Pine Ridge beneath several inches of fresh snow. Jack returned to the manager's office before breakfast, Buddy close beside him, and pulled the heavy bookcase away from the wall. The draft grew stronger immediately. He worked carefully with a pry bar and hammer, removing warped trim and sections of old paneling until a narrow vertical seam appeared in what had looked like solid stone. Behind it was not masonry at all, but a steel-framed service door painted to match the wall decades earlier. The hinges resisted at first, then gave with a long metallic groan. A steep stairway disappeared into darkness. Jack stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing moved below. Buddy sniffed the opening, ears forward, then descended one step at a time. Jack followed with a flashlight in one hand and the pry bar in the other. At the bottom they entered a surprisingly dry underground room lined with metal shelving. Dust covered everything, but the air was cool and stable. Along the walls sat cardboard archive boxes, rolled property maps, old ledgers, maintenance records, and personal belongings Jack recognized from childhood. His father's leather document case, a brass desk clock, even a cracked wooden frame that had once stood in Robert's study. In the far corner stood a large steel safe with a mechanical lock and a separate key slot. Jack touched its cold surface and felt the first real certainty that Pine Ridge had never been merely an abandoned lodge. He spent most of the morning opening boxes. At first, the contents seemed ordinary. Tax records, contractor invoices, title documents, photographs of the property before it closed. Then patterns began to emerge. Several envelopes contained hotel receipts from Denver, Aspen, and Salt Lake City, each charged to accounts connected to Robert's companies. Diane's name appeared repeatedly, often on dates when Robert's calendar showed her supposedly attending charity events or visiting family. Richard Cole's initials appeared on separate reservation records for the same hotels. Jack set the papers side by side. None of it proved an affair, but it was difficult to ignore. In one photograph taken outside a private restaurant, Diane stood beside Richard with her hand resting lightly on his arm. Their bodies turned toward each other with an ease that did not look professional. Jack felt an old bitterness rise, but he forced it down. He had spent too many years wanting confirmation that Diane was exactly what he had believed her to be. Wanting something to be true was not evidence. Still, Robert had preserved these records deliberately. That mattered more than Jack's instincts. Beyond the storage room, Buddy found another opening half hidden behind stacked wooden crates. It led into a narrow maintenance corridor, reinforced with concrete and old utility piping. The passage sloped gently downward before turning toward the rear of the lodge. Jack followed it perhaps 50 yards before reaching a rusted emergency door jammed shut by snow and debris on the other side. He made a mental note of the route and turned back. Pine Ridge had clearly been designed with more hidden infrastructure than the public building above suggested. He wondered whether Robert had known every inch of it, or whether some earlier owner had built the space for practical reasons. Buddy, less interested in architecture, stopped near a pile of old canvas bags and sneezed into the dust. Jack smiled, despite himself. Not exactly buried treasure, is it? The dog looked at him with the expression of someone unwilling to take responsibility for unrealistic expectations. Back in the underground room, Jack found a slim appointment book dated 7 years earlier. Robert's handwriting filled most pages in short, disciplined notes. Several entries included the initials DM and RC, followed by locations that matched the hotel receipts. One notation had been underlined twice. Ask why they were both there. Another read, "Do not confront yet. Verify first." Jack sat on an overturned crate and stared at the words. Robert had known something was wrong. Maybe not everything, but enough to begin watching the two people closest to him. That realization carried an unexpected sting. For years, Jack had imagined his father defending Diane blindly until the end. Instead, Robert had apparently begun doubting her long before his death. Why had he never called? Why let more years pass? Jack had no answer, only the same stubborn silence that had separated them. His phone rang shortly after noon. Richard Cole's name appeared on the screen. Jack let it ring twice before answering. Richard sounded almost cheerful. He explained that the holding company had reassessed the property and was now prepared to offer $500,000, provided Jack signed within 48 hours. The leap from $25,000 was so absurd that Jack nearly laughed. "What changed?" he asked. Richard answered smoothly that land values were complicated, and a buyer sometimes revised risk tolerance. Jack looked around the hidden room while listening. $500,000 for a collapsing lodge with no utilities? There was a pause just long enough to notice. Richard recovered quickly. "It is an unusually generous opportunity." Jack declined. Richard's tone cooled for the first time. "You may regret confusing suspicion with judgment." Jack ended the call without responding. Less than 10 minutes later, Diane called. Her voice was softer than Richard's, and more dangerous because of it. She said she was worried Jack was allowing pride to trap him again. $500,000, she reminded him, could give him a clean start. He could buy a home, replace the Chevrolet, stop taking temporary jobs. "Your father would not have wanted you buried under that place," she said. Jack almost asked how she knew what Robert wanted after years of telling Jack the man had left Pine Ridge as an insult. Instead, he watched Buddy sniff through the old records and said, "Maybe I'd rather decide that for myself." Diane sighed with practiced sadness. "Jack, some things are not worth digging into." The sentence hung between them. Jack's eyes moved toward the steel safe. "That sounds less like advice and more like a warning." Diane ended the call soon afterward. For the rest of the afternoon, Jack organized the documents into separate piles and photographed the most suspicious pages with his phone. He did not yet know what Robert had hidden in the safe, or why Pine Ridge mattered enough for Richard and Diane to multiply their offer 20 times in less than a week. But he knew one thing now. They were afraid of discovery, not liability. When darkness settled over the lodge, Jack locked the underground door behind him and returned upstairs with Buddy. The silver cufflink remained in one pocket, Robert's appointment book in another. Before leaving the office, he looked once more at the wall that had hidden the staircase for decades. "They want me gone," he said quietly. Buddy stood beside him, watching. Jack turned off the light. So we stay. The next morning, Jack returned to the underground room with coffee in a dented thermos and a new determination to stop guessing. Buddy moved ahead of him, nose tracing the floor and lower shelves, while Jack photographed documents and sorted them by date. Near the back wall, the German Shepherd suddenly stopped beside a row of steel cabinets, pushed his muzzle into the narrow space behind them, and began pawing at something hidden in the dust. Jack dragged one cabinet forward and found an old brown leather satchel wedged against the wall. The leather was cracked and stiff with age, and Robert's initials had been pressed faintly into one corner. Inside were several folded maps, a brass key, and a sealed envelope containing maintenance notes for the underground room. The key fit the safe. Jack stood in front of the steel door for several seconds before turning it. The lock released with a deep, mechanical click that echoed through the concrete chamber. Buddy sat beside him, ears forward. "All right," Jack whispered. "Let's see what Dad was protecting." The safe did not contain stacks of cash or gold. It contained something potentially more valuable. The upper shelves held original deeds, mineral rights certificates, geological surveys, and correspondence between Robert and several consulting firms. Jack spread the documents across a metal table and began reading. Pine Ridge's 24 acres sat above a mineral formation that earlier surveys had underestimated. More recent testing identified deposits containing commercially valuable strategic minerals used in advanced manufacturing, energy systems, and electronics. A private geological assessment placed the potential commercial value of the mineral rights at more than $180 million, depending on extraction costs, permits, and future market conditions. Jack read the number twice, then a third time. It was not money sitting in a bank account, and the report made that clear. Development could take years and might never reach the highest estimate, but Pine Ridge was not worthless. It was the opposite. The property Richard Cole had tried to buy for $25,000 might control rights worth more than most people earned in several lifetimes. Jack felt no rush of joy. His first emotion was anger. He remembered Richard's calm voice describing Pine Ridge as a liability. He remembered Diane's soft concern, her careful reminder that $500,000 could rescue him from sleeping in his Chevrolet. They had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Jack continued through the safe and found folders labeled with corporate names he had never heard before. Silvercrest Holdings, Northvale Management, Meridian Asset Services. At first they looked unrelated, but the same mailing addresses, signatures, and transfer dates appeared repeatedly. Robert had marked several pages in red ink. Money from his companies had been shifted into these entities through consulting fees, property purchases, and management agreements that made little business sense. Jack compared the names with the appointment book from the previous day. Richard Cole appeared as legal counsel on several transactions. Diane's signature appeared on authorization forms. One company listed a private mailbox connected to a hotel where both had stayed on the same weekend. What had looked like scattered suspicion was becoming a pattern. At the bottom of the safe, Jack found a thinner folder filled with photographs and printed messages. He sat down slowly as he opened it. The photographs were not ambiguous. Diane and Richard stood together outside restaurants, in hotel lobbies, and beside Richard's car far from any Miller property. In one image, Richard's arm was around Diane's waist. In another, she kissed his cheek while holding his hand. The printed messages were more damaging. They discussed Robert's declining health, which accounts remained under his direct control, and how long certain transfers would take before attracting attention. Some messages were disguised as discussions about legal work, but others contained the unmistakable intimacy of two people who had stopped pretending they were only colleagues. Jack felt the old argument with his father return with brutal clarity. Diane was exactly what he had believed she was. Yet being right brought no satisfaction. It only made the lost years heavier. Robert had defended her. Jack had walked away. And somewhere between those two choices, Diane and Richard had apparently built a private life around the fortune of the man standing between them. Jack leaned back against the concrete wall and closed his eyes. He could still hear Robert's voice from more than a decade earlier. "You see enemies because that is what the military trained you to see." Jack had hated him for saying it. for... Now he understood how badly Robert must have wanted the warning to be wrong. A lonely widower had found someone who seemed to make the house feel less empty, and admitting Jack was right would have meant admitting that comfort itself had been purchased with deception. Still, Jack could not excuse what came after. Robert had chosen pride, and Jack had answered with pride of his own. Buddy walked over and rested his head against Jack's knee. Jack scratched behind the dog's ear, staring at the documents spread across the table. "I spent years wanting proof," he said quietly. "Turns out proof doesn't make anything better." Buddy remained there, warm and steady, asking nothing of him. By late afternoon, Jack had photographed every important page and separated the most critical originals from the rest. He now understood why Diane and Richard wanted Pine Ridge so badly. The lodge hid both a fortune they hoped to control and evidence that could destroy them. What Jack still did not understand was how much Robert had known, or why he had chosen to leave all of this buried instead of confronting them directly. That answer, if it existed, was not in the folders he had opened yet. Jack locked the safe again, placed the brass key in his pocket, and looked around the underground room. Above him stood a ruined lodge that everyone had dismissed. Beneath it lay a map of betrayal worth more than $180 million. For the first time since Robert's death, Jack no longer wondered whether his father had been wrong about Diane. He knew. The harder question now was why Robert had waited so long to admit it. That night, Pine Ridge was quieter than usual. Wind moved through the pines outside. But beneath the lodge, the underground room felt sealed away from the world. Jack sat alone at the metal table with Buddy curled near his boots, surrounded by the evidence Robert had hidden. He had already found the mineral reports, the shell companies, the hotel records, the photographs, and the messages between Diane and Richard. What he had not found was Robert's explanation. Near the back of the safe, beneath a stack of property folders, Jack discovered a small digital recorder wrapped in cloth and a white envelope with his name written across the front in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. Jack stared at it longer than he wanted to admit. For 13 years, he had imagined what he would say if his father ever called. Now Robert had found a way to speak only after there could be no answer. Jack pressed the recorder's button. Robert's voice was weaker than Jack remembered. The authority was still there, but age and illness had roughened it. He began without ceremony. He said he had learned of Diane's affair with Richard nearly a year before his death. At first he refused to believe it, then quietly hired investigators and reviewed accounts himself. What he found was worse than adultery. Diane and Richard had been moving money through shell companies, shifting properties, and preparing legal documents that would give them greater control if Robert's health failed. Robert admitted that his condition had already weakened him enough to make resistance difficult. He did not know how far their plan would go, only that they had stopped thinking of him as a husband or client and begun treating him as an obstacle. Jack listened without moving. Buddy raised his head once at the sound of Robert's voice, then settled again. The recording continued. Robert explained that he could not simply confront them. Richard controlled too many legal channels, Diane had access to too many private records, and any public accusation without complete evidence could have allowed them to destroy what remained. So Robert began building a trap. He restructured several trusts, placed restrictions on major assets, and wrote clauses that would freeze Diane's access if fraud or coercion were formally proven. He moved original documents to Pine Ridge because no one cared about the lodge. It was old, broken, isolated, and commercially useless on the surface. That made it safe. Robert also preserved Pine Ridge's mineral rights separately and transferred the property directly to Jack. "They will think I left you a burden," Robert said on the recording. "That is exactly what I need them to think." Jack looked at the steel walls around him and finally understood the design. His father had hidden the most valuable truth inside the least valuable-looking thing he owned. Then Robert's voice changed. The legal precision disappeared. He sounded tired. "Jack, you were right about her." The words hit harder than the $180 million report ever had. Robert admitted that Jack had seen Diane more clearly than he had, and that Robert's loneliness after Margaret's death had made him willing to believe what he wanted to believe. He had mistaken comfort for loyalty, and Jack's warning for disrespect. Worse, he had chosen Diane over his own son, and defended her long after he should have listened. "I spent years protecting the woman who betrayed me," Robert said, "and in doing so, I drove away the one person who never did." Jack lowered his head. For years he had wanted those exact words. Now they felt like a door opening into an empty room. The letter said even more. Robert wrote that he had considered calling Jack many times after discovering the truth, but pride stopped him. He was ashamed to admit that the son he had accused of bitterness had been right all along. Jack read the sentence twice, then remembered his own final words from 13 years earlier. "If you marry her, don't call me home." At the time, he had believed he was setting a boundary. Now he saw the cruelty hidden inside the certainty. Diane had caused the fracture, but she had not kept the two men apart every day after that. Pride had done that. Robert's pride. Jack's pride. Two stubborn men had spent more than a decade waiting for the other to move first. Buddy stood, crossed the small space, and rested his head against Jack's thigh. Jack placed one hand on the dog's neck and let the silence sit where anger used to be. Robert's final instructions were simple. He told Jack not to trust appearances, not to sell Pine Ridge quickly, and not to confuse the mineral value with the real reason he had left the property to him. The evidence inside the lodge could expose Diane and Richard, but the decision of what Pine Ridge became afterward belonged entirely to Jack. Robert did not ask forgiveness outright. Perhaps even at the end he could not bring himself to beg for anything. Instead he wrote, "I cannot repair the years I wasted. I can only leave you the truth and hope you build something better from it than I did." Jack folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. For a long time, he sat beside Buddy without speaking. Pine Ridge no longer felt like an insult, and it no longer felt like a fortune either. It felt like the last unfinished conversation between a father and son who had both waited too long. Jack had spent years believing Robert died stubborn, blind, and convinced that Jack had abandoned him. Now he knew his father had understood everything before the end. The knowledge did not erase the anger or restore the lost years, but it changed their meaning. When Jack finally stood, he placed the recorder and letter in a separate waterproof case. "He knew," he said quietly. Buddy looked up at him. Jack turned off the underground lights and paused at the bottom of the stairs. For the first time since Robert's death, he no longer felt that Pine Ridge had been left to him as punishment. It was an apology. A late one, an imperfect one, but an apology all the same. The storm reached Pine Ridge shortly after midnight, driving snow sideways across the lodge and erasing the service road beneath a white sheet. Jack was still awake in the manager's office, Robert's recorder and the most important documents spread across the desk, while Buddy slept near the doorway. He had spent the evening photographing every critical page and sending copies through his phone whenever the weak mountain signal appeared. The files went to a secure cloud account, and to Sheriff Daniel Brooks, a 58-year-old county sheriff Jack had contacted earlier that afternoon after deciding the evidence was too serious to keep to himself. Brooks was broad-shouldered but slightly heavy around the middle, with short iron-gray hair, a weathered face, and a thick mustache that made him look sterner than he was. 25 years in rural law enforcement had made him patient, skeptical, and deeply suspicious of stories that sounded too dramatic, but he had agreed to review the documents Jack sent. Jack had just transmitted the last batch when Buddy's head snapped up. The dog rose without barking, ears forward, body rigid. A second later, Jack heard engines outside. 3 sets of headlights cut through the snow. A black SUV stopped near the entrance, followed by 2 pickups. Jack switched off the office lamp and moved to the window. Diane stepped from the SUV wearing a dark wool coat and leather gloves, her blonde hair hidden beneath a hood. Richard Cole came out beside her, no longer wearing the polished expression Jack remembered from Denver. 2 large men climbed from the pickups. One was Mark Dugan, a thick-necked man in his early 40s with a shaved head, broken nose, and heavy brown beard. He moved with the confidence of someone used to intimidating people physically. The other, Evan Price, was younger and leaner, with close-cut black hair, pale skin, and restless eyes that rarely stopped scanning the building. Jack did not know either man, but he recognized intent immediately. These were not lawyers coming to negotiate. He slipped Robert's recorder and the waterproof case containing copies of key documents into a maintenance compartment beneath the floorboards, then took the original folder and moved toward the hallway. Buddy stayed at his left side. Diane entered first. "Jack," she called over the wind, "we can still end this without making it worse." Her voice had lost its practiced sympathy. Jack remained behind the corner of the corridor. "You mean before people learn what you and Richard were doing?" Silence followed. Then Cole spoke. "Those documents belong to the estate." Jack almost smiled. "Interesting. Last week you said everything in this building was worthless." Mark forced open the side door with his shoulder, and the confrontation changed instantly. Jack moved before the man expected him to. Years as a Navy SEAL had taught him that hesitation was often more dangerous than action. He used the narrow corridor to prevent both men from reaching him at once, drove Mark backward into the wall, and knocked a heavy flashlight from Evan's hand when the younger man rushed in. The fight was fast, ugly, and exhausting. Jack was still strong, but he was 47, underfed, and years removed from active service. Mark outweighed him by perhaps 50 pounds. Every impact reminded Jack that training did not make age disappear. Buddy's barking filled the lodge as Diane and Cole retreated toward the office. Jack managed to break free and move deeper into the building, forcing the others to follow through tighter spaces. He knew Pine Ridge now. They did not. But Evan suddenly grabbed Buddy by the collar near the broken stairwell, pulling the dog toward a gap where part of the floor had collapsed. Buddy twisted violently, claws scraping against the boards. Jack had the original folder under one arm. Cole stood only a few yards away, staring at it. For one suspended second, the choice was perfectly clear. Keep the evidence or reach Buddy before the dog slipped. Jack threw the folder aside and lunged. He caught Buddy's harness just as Evan lost his grip, hauling the German Shepherd away from the broken edge. Cole snatched the documents from the floor. "Finally," he said, breathless with triumph. Diane looked almost relieved. Jack did not argue. He simply backed toward the east wing, with Buddy pressed close beside him. Mark blocked the main exit, so Jack turned toward the old maintenance passage he had discovered days earlier. He pulled the hidden door open, shoved Buddy through first, and followed into the narrow concrete corridor. Cole shouted behind them, but the passage was too tight for the group to pursue quickly. Jack and Buddy moved through darkness until they reached the rusted emergency door at the far end. Jack drove his shoulder into it twice before the frozen debris outside gave way. They emerged behind the lodge into knee-deep snow. Buddy limped slightly but remained on his feet. Jack crouched beside him, checked his legs quickly, then heard a new sound rising above the storm. Sirens. Sheriff Brooks arrived with 2 county cruisers and a state police vehicle less than 10 minutes later. Jack had triggered an emergency message before the confrontation began, and the documents already sent had been enough for Brooks to act. Officers surrounded the lodge. Diane, Cole, Mark, and Evan were detained, while Cole continued insisting the matter was a civil property dispute. That argument ended when Brooks held up his phone. "I already have the financial records," he said, "and so does the state investigator." Cole's face changed. He looked at the folder in his hands, then at Jack. Only then did he understand that stealing the originals had accomplished almost nothing. By dawn, Pine Ridge was surrounded by police tape and emergency vehicles. Diane sat in the back of a cruiser, her carefully constructed composure gone. Cole was taken separately for questioning, while the 2 men who had forced entry were arrested on charges related to the break-in and assault. Brooks told Jack that the financial evidence would likely trigger a broader investigation, and that several assets connected to Diane and the shell companies were already being flagged for temporary restraint. Nothing was finished yet, but the balance had changed. Jack stood beneath the lodge awning with Buddy leaning against his leg. He looked down at the dog and scratched gently behind the graying ear. "You cost me the originals?" Jack said. Buddy looked up at him. Jack smiled faintly. "Good trade." By spring, the snow had retreated from Pine Ridge, and the investigation had moved far beyond the lodge. State and federal authorities traced the shell companies Robert had documented, froze several disputed assets, and confirmed that Jack's deed to Pine Ridge and its mineral rights was valid. Diane and Richard Cole now faced a long legal fight over fraud, conspiracy, and the financial transfers Robert had uncovered. Jack avoided the courthouse whenever he could. He had already spent too many years letting other people's choices shape his life. What mattered now was the mountain. A mining company eventually approached him with a limited development proposal covering only a portion of the mineral rights, structured so Jack could retain ownership of Pine Ridge itself. The agreement would never hand him the full theoretical value of the deposit, but it provided enough capital to change his life permanently. Jack signed only after independent attorneys and geologists reviewed every page. He had learned what happened when trust replaced verification. The first money Jack spent was not on a new house. It went into the lodge. Pine Ridge needed almost everything: a new roof over the east wing, electrical systems, plumbing, reinforced foundations, safe staircases, new windows, and a commercial kitchen. Jack hired local contractors whenever possible, starting with people Tom Harris recommended from Elk River. Among them was Maria Lopez, a 44-year-old restaurant manager with dark, wavy hair usually tied behind her head, warm brown skin, and quick, observant eyes. She had spent 15 years managing diners and small hotels before the last place she worked closed unexpectedly, leaving her unemployed with 2 children still at home. Mariah was practical, direct, and unimpressed by Jack's new wealth. On their first meeting, she walked through the half-repaired dining room, pointed at 3 obvious mistakes in the proposed kitchen layout, and told him he would lose money if he ignored them. Jack hired her that afternoon. Construction lasted more than a year. Jack worked alongside the crews whenever they would let him, carrying lumber, repairing old stonework, and learning more about hospitality than he had ever wanted to know. Buddy followed him through the rebuilding process, older now and moving more slowly but still insisting on inspecting every delivery truck that arrived. The people Jack hired were not charity cases. They were carpenters, cooks, cleaners, servers, mechanics, landscapers, and maintenance workers who had skills but needed stable work. Some had been laid off from mills or construction companies. Others had been commuting hours for seasonal jobs. Jack understood them because he had been one of them. Pine Ridge began paying steady wages long before the first guest checked in. That mattered to him more than the polished stone fireplace or the restored wooden beams. When Pine Ridge Lodge reopened, Jack kept the original name. The new property combined a mountain lodge with a restaurant built around local ingredients and simple food rather than luxury pretension. Maria ran the dining room and kitchen operation with the discipline of a field commander, while Jack handled maintenance, land management, and everything that broke at inconvenient hours. Word spread slowly at first, then quickly. Travelers came for the mountain views, hikers stayed for weekends, families drove up from Denver, and the restaurant became popular enough that reservations were often full during peak season. Elk River changed with it. A gas station expanded its hours. The hardware store hired 2 younger workers. Tom's feed business picked up new supply contracts. None of it turned the town into something unrecognizable. It simply gave more people a reason to stay. 3 years after the night of the storm, Jack stood on the front porch of Pine Ridge after closing time. The lodge glowed behind him, its windows casting warm rectangles across the dark snow. One by one, employees walked toward the parking lot, laughing, calling goodnight, and starting their cars for the drive home. Jack recognized nearly every vehicle now. Maria waved from her pickup before pulling away. Buddy lay beside Jack on a thick mat near the porch heater, his muzzle almost completely gray and his movements slower than before. The old German shepherd no longer patrolled the halls all night, but he still raised his head whenever Jack stepped outside. Beyond the employee lot, under a simple covered shelter, sat the old dark blue Chevrolet Suburban. Jack had been offered more than once to have it hauled away. He always refused. The paint was faded, the seats were worn, and one door still needed a hard pull to close properly. Years earlier, that vehicle had held everything Jack owned. He had slept behind its steering wheel, counted coins for food, and wondered how long he could keep pretending he was only temporarily homeless. Now it stood within sight of a lodge filled with guests, a restaurant full most weekends, and dozens of people who depended on Pine Ridge for a paycheck. The contrast still felt impossible sometimes. Jack lowered himself onto the porch step and rested a hand on Buddy's neck. Robert had left him property worth millions, but the number mattered less with every passing year. Money had exposed Diane and Richard. It had repaired roofs and paid contractors. It had given Jack options he never thought he would have again. But it had not been the thing that stayed beside him in the Chevrolet. It had not forgiven the years lost between father and son. It had not turned Pine Ridge into a place where people could build ordinary, dependable lives. Jack looked toward the old SUV, then back at the lodge Robert once thought no one would value. "Not bad, Buddy," he said. Buddy's tail thumped once against the porch. Jack smiled. For the first time in a very long while, there was nowhere else he needed to be. Jack's journey reminds us that the greatest treasures in life are not always measured in money. Sometimes they are found in forgiveness, loyalty, second chances, and the courage to build something good from what once caused us pain. What looked like a worthless lodge became a blessing, and perhaps that is how God's miracles often enter our lives, not always as something magnificent, but as a door we almost refuse to open. In our own lives, hardship can hide purpose, and loss can still lead us toward something meaningful. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for staying with us until the end. May God bless you, your family, and every new beginning ahead.